Hello bow hunters, this is Ron again with Stay Sharp. In this sharpening and sharpness evaluation video, we're going to be looking at the Hunor Attillas. Now I bought these, I had them sent to me from Hungary. Because of the steel. The steel is Böhler M390. No other broadhead maker is using this steel, and that steel has a very impressive pedigree. Namely its hardness, Rockwell 59, and the fact that it's corrosion resistant and that it is a sintered metal, meaning that it was a powdered metal technology, and then they turn it into some fantastic blades. Now this is used for metal, to cut metal. This is used by custom knife makers, and because I've been making knives since 1982, when I learned that a broadhead maker was actually using Böhler M390 in their blades, I had to send away for some. And so now we're going to look at this under the same protocols we use for every other head. We're going to look at it under the microscope, we're going to put it in the sharpness tester, and then we're going to talk about sharpening. So stay tuned. As you could see from the magnified view of the edge, Hunor really values sharpness and puts a good edge on their blades. But let's get a baseline and see how sharp it really is. .208. That is sharp. That falls in my listing of out-of-the-box sharpness. I'll show you that chart right now. The head is sharp. The out-of-the-box sharpness, as I say, is always a snapshot in time. It's sharp until you practice with it, until you take an animal with it. And these blades, being as thick as they are definitely worth resharpening, especially with this Böhler steel. This is some great steel. These are not a disposable blade. You will want to resharpen these again. So after you dull it, you will need to sharpen it, and that's what we're going to discuss next. Here's a look at the Hunor Attilla disassembled. The screw is very stout. I mean, it's not like most screws that have a big head and a tiny body. That is a very unique screw, but very strong looking. In order to change their weight, they offer different. This happens to be brass because I bought the 200 grain, and a very short and stout aluminum ferrule. But to protect the screw and the ferrule during sharpening on a blade like this, I would recommend taking it off the ferrule, and then I would couple it with our version C guide and set the screws in the second position from the bottom. That will closely match the factory angle. So I will position it like that so that the blade is centered. Then when I drop a square sharpening dowel on there, let's try here, you'll see that I'm pretty close to the factory edge, a little bit steeper. I could drop down to the final setting, but if you followed my channel, you know that I'm a fan of a little bit steeper bevel grinds. If you want to match the factory grind, go ahead, drop down one setting. I contend that if you have a little bit steeper bevel grind, first of all, you spend less time sharpening because you're only sharpening out here, where all the damage would occur. When you pass through an animal into the dirt, the nicks are usually within the first 20 thousandths, so why not strengthen that up with a little bit steeper angle? So that's what I'm going to go ahead and do on this one, and we'll come back and talk about sharpening next. So let's talk about using the C guide to sharpen the Hunor Atilla. Because I'm going to only be sharpening out on the edge, I'm at a little higher setting. Again, I said I like a little bit steeper angle. I'm only going to be coloring it up with Sharpie marker out on the edge. The blade placement as shown. Now, we ship the version C kit with the double cut file, the wood dowel, buffing compound, 5 sheets of sandpaper going from 240 to 400 to 800 to 12 to 2500 grit. You can cut that sandpaper down to strips that you would wrap around the wooden dowel and secure with tape, but in this case it's a convex edge, so we tell people if you've got a convex edge, just email us after you've placed your order and ask for the square dowel. Same thing, I cut it into strips, I pre-bend it, and then hold it to the dowel with tape. This way you can make 5 different grits of sharpening sticks with silicone carbide sandpaper. And the only thing harder than that is diamonds. This is not a dull head. This is a new head. There aren't any big dings or nicks that would cause me to use 240 and 400, so I'm going to start with 800 grit. I suggest you do a pulling backward stroke with the silicone carbide paper. If you try to cut into it, you may risk actually cutting the paper. But you can start from the tip to the back, from the back to the tip, from the middle to the tip, middle to the back. Ultimately, you're going to find a method that works best for you. But this is the process of sharpening a convex edge using the C guide. Now, you want to stick with one grit, in this case 800, and only one side until, and if you've watched my channel, you know, until you reach the burr. Now, I'm using basically the back end and about half. You can turn the stick around and get more usage out of the sandpaper just by spinning it. So I'm going to keep going on 800 grit until I've achieved a burr that will appear on the other side, a burr that I will then try to detect with a very narrow piece of Post-it note, no more than 1/4 of an inch wide, especially with a curved profile. You do not want a wide sheet. You're only going to be testing in the area of the curve, which is pretty darn small for testing. But in the little while that I've been sharpening, while we talked, I've taken off the Sharpie marker at the very cutting edge, so you can see that's the amount that I'm attacking. I'm not matching the factory grind, and you don't have to match the factory grind. In this case, I want a steeper angle. So I'm going to keep going at 800 grit, and I'll come back when I have a burr, and we'll talk about what that looks like. All right, so I talked about how great this steel it is, and it is, but this is silicone carbide. The only thing harder than that is diamond, so that's going to be able to sharpen it. So let's look to see if we've got our burr. That clicking sound is me catching on that burr. And when I catch on it, the paper flexes. until I push so hard it jumps off. So I have now achieved an 800 grit burr on the opposite side of what I was sharpening. I sharpened on this side. The burr formation is on this side. That means I flip the guide over and I immediately work to erase the burr that I spent that time trying to get. And I'm going to sharpen this side now until I achieve a second burr. When I've achieved 2 burrs at 800 grit, that is my signal to take this 800 grit off and switch to 1200 grit next. So I will keep sharpening on this side and I will come back and discuss further. So now I've got my 1200 grit silicone carbide sandpaper on there, and I've been sharpening for a while, so it's time to see if I've got a burr. Yes, I do. It's catching all the way along the edge. Now this burr is very fine. When I was doing my second burr on 800 grit, I just happened to catch my eye when I was breaking the burr off what it looked like. A small strip of burr became dislodged from the blade. So I took a close-up photo of it. I'm going to put it in here right now. That little wire is what I'm talking about, the burr. So now that I've got a burr on this side of the blade with 1200, I'm going to go on the other side and erase that 1200 grit burr, create a second 1200 grit burr, and then I'm going to switch to 2500 grit and repeat the process. So I will return. So I've switched to the 2500 grit sandpaper after doing 8 and 12. Now I'm going to check for a burr. Well, 2500 grit burr is very small, but you can see the paper is still hanging up on it the entire length. That is my signal that I have now gone far enough at 2500 grit, and we're starting to produce a very polished edge. Now I will flip it over and use the same 2500 grit to break off that burr and create a second burr with 2500 grit. When I do that, then I can do some alternating strokes before I go into buffing. I'll do this side, I'll do this side. I want to break off that thin wire that I showed you earlier. I want to make sure that it's all gone. I want no burr left behind. That little burr can mimic dullness, and I want none of that left behind. So I'm going to spend a bunch of time on this side, get a burr, and then I'm going to do those alternating strokes to make sure the burr is gone before we go into buffing compound, and we'll talk about buffing compound next. Now that we've achieved 2 burrs with every grit of the silicone carbide sandpaper, we're going to be doing the final step, which is buffing, and in this case we'll use the round wooden dowel. We're going to coat it up with the buffing compound. Buffing compound is just a wax with a powdered abrasive suspended in the wax. The wax is doing nothing except being the vehicle for the powdered abrasive. So we've covered it now, and the process is the same. Always use a pulling motion, and you are buffing that edge to a mirror finish. What you cannot feel, even with a piece of paper, is a buffed edged burr. So when you're buffing, do as many strokes as you care to. You cannot overdo this step. All you're doing is making that edge more razor-like, more polished, more like a scalpel with each stroke. And you will see the stick is turning black. That's the metal coming off the blade, but it's not enough to produce a burr. So sharpen one side, or I should say strop one side, and then flip it over. Do the other side. Keep flipping. Do a bunch on one side, flip it over, do it on the other side, flip it over. And the burr that you are creating is microscopic. It is tiny, but you want to get rid of it. So alternating, sharpen one side, do the other side. Drop one side, do the other side. Make sure you get rid of every little bit of burr. I'm going to keep going with this drop, and then we're going to look at it under the microscope next, and then in the sharpness tester. The edge that we produced looked pretty good under the microscope. You cannot cheat a microscope edge, and you cannot cheat a sharpness tester's edge. So let's see what sort of an edge we got. .127. That is sharp and sharper than a razor blade, and I'll show you how a razor blade scores. Well, I think we did a pretty good job on this edge using the Stay Sharp version C guide. Now, when it comes to trailing edges, you could reposition the blade in there. In that case, you would use the round dowel and wrap the sandpaper around it. I don't value trailing edge sharpness. It really doesn't mean anything to me. Even with a single bevel, yes, it'll help aid in rotation, but on a double bevel, it's not doing anything except being cosmetic. If you did not pass through and we're hoping that that little blade was going to cut something on the way out, you've already failed and you're kind of grasping at straws. But certainly you could loosen the screw, position it with both bat wings facing the back, and sharpen the trailing edges if you wished. It's certainly up to you. I don't do that. I don't value trailing edge sharpness, but that is a good score, and that is the Hunor Atilla sharpened with the Stay Sharp version C guide. Thanks for watching.